Many years ago, as evening was closing in, the Venerable Pedro Arbuez d'Espila, sixth prior of the Dominicans of Segovia and third Grand Inquisitor of Spain, followed by a Fra Redemptor and preceded by two familiars of the Holy Office, the latter carrying lanterns, made their way to a subterranean dungeon. The bolt of a massive door creaked, and they entered a mephitic in-pace, where the dim light revealed between rings fastened to the wall a blood-stained rack, a brazier, and a jug. On a pile of straw loaded with fetters and his neck encircled by an iron carcan sat a haggard man of uncertain age, clothed in rags. This prisoner was no other than Rabbi Esser Abarbanel, a Jew of Aragon, who, accused of usury and pitiless scorn for the poor, had been daily subjected to torture for more than a year. Yet his blindness was as dense as his hide, and he had refused to abjure his faith. Proud of affiliation dating back thousands of years, proud of his ancestors, for all Jews worthy of the name are vain of their blood, he descended Talmudically from Othoniel, and consequently from Ipsaboa, the wife of the last judge of Israel, a circumstance which had sustained his courage amid incessant torture. With tears in his eyes at the thought of this resolute soul rejecting salvation, the Venerable Pedro Arbuez d'Espila, approaching the shuddering rabbi, addressed him as follows. "My son, rejoice. Your trials here below are about to end. If in the presence of such obstinacy I was forced to permit with deep regret the use of great severity, my task of fraternal correction has its limits. You are the fig tree which, having failed so many times to bear fruit, at last withered, but God alone can judge your soul. Perhaps infinite mercy will shine upon you at the last moment. We must hope so. There are examples, so sleep in peace tonight. Tomorrow you will be included in the auto da fe, that is, you will be exposed to the quemadero, the symbolical flames of everlasting fire. It burns, as you know, only at a distance, my son, and death is at least 2 hours, often 3 in coming, on account of the wet, iced bandages with which we protect the heads and hearts of the condemned. There will be 43 of you. Placed in the last row, you will have time to invoke God and offer to him this baptism of fire, which is of the Holy Spirit. Hope in the light and rest." With these words, having signed to his companions to unchain the prisoner, the prior tenderly embraced him. Then came the turn of the Fra Redemptor, who in a low tone entreated the Jew's forgiveness for what he had made him suffer for the purpose of redeeming him. Then the two familiars silently kissed him. This ceremony over, the captive was left, solitary and bewildered, in the darkness. Rabbi Esser Abarbanel, with parched lips and visage worn by suffering, at first gazed at the closed door with vacant eyes. Closed? The word unconsciously roused a vague fancy in his mind, the fancy that he had seen for an instant the light of the lanterns through a chink between the door and the wall. A morbid idea of hope, due to the weakness of his brain, stirred his whole being. He dragged himself toward the strange appearance. Then, very gently and cautiously, slipping one finger into the crevice, he drew the door toward him. Marvelous! By an extraordinary accident, the familiar who closed it had turned the huge key an instant before it struck the stone casing, so that the rusty bolt not having entered the hole, the door again rolled on its hinges. The rabbi ventured to glance outside. By the aid of a sort of luminous dusk, he distinguished at first a semicircle of walls indented by winding stairs, and opposite to him, at the top of 5 or 6 stone steps, a sort of black portal opening into an immense corridor whose first arches only were visible from below. Stretching himself flat, he crept to the threshold. Yes, it was really a corridor, but endless in length. A wan light illumined it. Lamps suspended from the vaulted ceiling lightened at intervals the dull hue of the atmosphere. The distance was veiled in shadow. Not a single door appeared in the whole extent. Only on one side, the left, heavily grated loopholes sunk in the walls admitted a light which must be that of evening, for crimson bars at intervals rested on the flags of the pavement. What a terrible silence! Yet yonder, at the far end of that passage, there might be a doorway of escape. The Jew's vacillating hope was tenacious, for it was the last. Without hesitating, he ventured on the flags, keeping close under the loopholes, trying to make himself part of the blackness of the long walls. He advanced slowly, dragging himself along on his breast, forcing back the cry of pain when some raw wound sent a keen pang through his whole body. Suddenly the sound of a sandaled foot approaching reached his ears. He trembled violently. Fear stifled him. His sight grew dim. Well, it was over, no doubt. He pressed himself into a niche and, half lifeless with terror, waited. It was a familiar hurrying along. He passed swiftly by, holding in his clenched hand an instrument of torture, a frightful figure, and vanished. The suspense which the rabbi had endured seemed to have suspended the functions of life, and he lay nearly an hour unable to move. Fearing an increase of tortures if he were captured, he thought of returning to his dungeon. But the old hope whispered in his soul that divine perhaps, which comforts us in our sorest trials. A miracle had happened. He could doubt no longer. He began to crawl toward the chance of escape. Exhausted by suffering and hunger, trembling with pain, he pressed onward. The sepulchral corridor seemed to lengthen mysteriously, while he, still advancing, gazed into the gloom where there must be some avenue of escape. Oh! He again heard footsteps, but this time they were slower, more heavy. The white and black forms of two inquisitors appeared, emerging from the obscurity beyond. They were conversing in low tones and seemed to be discussing some important subject, for they were gesticulating vehemently. At this spectacle, Rabbi Esser Abarbanel closed his eyes. His heart beat so violently that it almost suffocated him. His rags were damp with the cold sweat of agony. He lay motionless by the wall, his mouth wide open under the rays of a lamp, praying to the God of David. Just opposite to him, the two inquisitors paused under the light of the lamp, doubtless owing to some accident due to the course of their argument. One, while listening to his companion, gazed at the rabbi, and beneath the look, whose absence of expression the hapless man did not at first notice, he fancied he again felt the burning pincers scorch his flesh. He was to be once more a living wound. Fainting, breathless, with fluttering eyelids, he shivered at the touch of the monk's floating robe. But strange yet natural fact, the inquisitor's gaze was evidently that of a man deeply absorbed in his intended reply, engrossed by what he was hearing. His eyes were fixed and seemed to look at the Jew without seeing him. In fact, after the lapse of a few minutes, the two gloomy figures slowly pursued their way, still conversing in low tones, toward the place whence the prisoner had come. He had not been seen. Amid the horrible confusion of the rabbi's thoughts, the idea darted through his brain. Can I be already dead, that they did not see me? A hideous impression roused him from his lethargy. In looking at the wall against which his face was pressed, he imagined he beheld two fierce eyes watching him. He flung his head back in a sudden frenzy of fright, his hair fairly bristling. Yet no. His hand groped over the stones. It was the reflection of his inquisitor's eyes, still retained in his own, which had been refracted from two spots on the wall. Forward, he must hasten toward that goal which he fancied, absurdly no doubt, to be deliverance, toward the darkness from which he was now barely 30 paces distant. He pressed forward, faster on his knees, his hands at full length, dragging himself painfully along, and soon entered the dark portion of this terrible and appalling corridor. Suddenly the poor wretch felt a gust of cold air on the hands resting upon the flags. It came from under the little door to which the two walls led. Oh, heaven, if that door should open outward! Every nerve in the miserable fugitive's body thrilled with hope. He examined it from top to bottom, though scarcely able to distinguish its outlines in the surrounding darkness. He passed his hand over it. No bolt, no lock. A latch. He started up. The latch yielded to the pressure of his thumb. The door silently swung open before him. "Hallelujah!" murmured the rabbi in a transport of gratitude, as standing on the threshold he beheld the scene before him. The door had opened into the gardens, above which arched a starlit sky, into spring, liberty, life. It revealed the neighboring fields, stretching toward the Sierras, whose sinuous blue lines were revealed against the horizon. Yonder lay freedom. Oh, to escape! He would journey all night through the lemon groves, whose fragrance reached him. Once in the mountains, and he was safe. He inhaled the delicious air. The breeze revived him. His lungs expanded. He felt in his swelling heart the veni faras of Lazarus. And to thank once more the God who had bestowed this mercy upon him, he extended his arms, raising his eyes toward heaven. It was an ecstasy of joy. Then he fancied he saw the shadow of his arms approach him, fancied that he felt those shadowy arms enclose, embrace him, and that he was pressed tenderly to someone's breast. A tall figure actually did stand directly before him. He lowered his eyes and remained motionless, gasping for breath, dazed, with fixed eyes, fairly driveling with terror. Horror! He was in the clasp of the Grand Inquisitor himself, the venerable Pedro Arbuez d'Espila, who gazed at him with tearful eyes, like a good shepherd who had found his stray lamb. The dark-robed priest pressed the hapless Jew to his heart with so fervent an outburst of love that the edges of the monocle haircloth rubbed the Dominican's breast. And while Aser Abarbanel, with protruding eyes, gasped in agony in the ascetic's embrace, vaguely comprehending that all the phases of this fatal evening were only a prearranged torture, that of hope, the Grand Inquisitor, with an accent of touching reproach and a look of consternation, murmured in his ear, his breath parched and burning from long fasting. "What, my son? On the eve, perchance, of salvation, you wished to leave us?" It is, I confess, with considerable diffidence that I approach the strange narrative which I am about to relate. The events which I propose detailing are of so extraordinary and unheard of a character that I am quite prepared to meet with an unusual amount of incredulity and scorn. I accept all such beforehand. I have, I trust, the literary courage to face unbelief. I have, after mature consideration, resolved to narrate in as simple and straightforward a manner as I can compass some facts that passed under my observation in the month of July last, and which in the annals of the mysteries of physical science are wholly unparalleled. I live at No. 26th Street in this city. The house is in some respects a curious one. It has enjoyed for the last 2 years the reputation of being haunted. It is a large and stately residence, surrounded by what was once a garden, but which is now only a green enclosure used for bleaching clothes. The dry basin of what has been a fountain, and a few fruit trees, ragged and unpruned, indicate that this spot in past days was a pleasant, shady retreat, filled with fruits and flowers and the sweet murmur of waters. The house is very spacious. A hall of noble size leads to a vast spiral staircase winding through its center, while the various apartments are of imposing dimensions. It was built some 15 or 20 years since by Mr. A, a well-known New York merchant, who 5 years ago threw the commercial world into convulsions by a stupendous bank fraud. Mr. A, as everyone knows, escaped to Europe, and died not long after of a broken heart. Almost immediately after the news of his decease reached this country and was verified, the report spread in 26th Street that number blank was haunted. Legal measures had dispossessed the widow of its former owner, and it was inhabited merely by a caretaker and his wife, placed there by the house agent into whose hands it had passed for purposes of renting or sale. These people declared that they were troubled with unnatural noises. Doors were opened without any visible agency. The remnants of furniture scattered through the various rooms were, during the night, piled one upon the other by unknown hands. Invisible feet passed up and down the stairs in broad daylight, accompanied by the rustle of unseen silk dresses and the gliding of viewless hands along the massive balusters. The caretaker and his wife declared that they would live there no longer. The house agent laughed, dismissed them, and put others in their place. The noises and supernatural manifestations continued. The neighborhood caught up the story, and the house remained untenanted for 3 years. Several parties negotiated for it, but somehow, always before the bargain was closed, they heard the unpleasant rumors and declined to treat any further. It was in this state of things that my landlady, who at that time kept a boarding house in Bleecker Street, and who wished to move farther uptown, conceived the bold idea of renting number blank 26th Street. Happening to have in her house rather a plucky and philosophical set of boarders, she laid her scheme before us, stating candidly everything she had heard respecting the ghostly qualities of the establishment to which she wished to remove us. With the exception of 1 or 2 timid persons, a sea captain and a returned Californian, who immediately gave notice that they would leave, every one of Mrs. Moffat's guests declared that they would accompany her in her chivalric incursion into the abode of spirit. Our removal was effected in the month of May, and we were all charmed with our new residence. The portion of 26th Street where our house is situated, between 7th and 8th Avenues, is one of the pleasantest localities in New York. The gardens back of the houses, running down nearly to the Hudson, form in the summertime a perfect avenue of verdure. The air is pure and invigorating, sweeping as it does straight across the river from the Weehawken Heights, and even the ragged garden which surrounded the house on 2 sides, although displaying on washing days rather too much clothesline, still gave us a piece of green sward to look at, and a cool retreat in the summer evenings, where we smoked our cigars in the dusk and watched the fireflies flashing their dark lanterns in the long grass. Of course, we had no sooner established ourselves at number blank than we began to expect the ghosts. We absolutely awaited their advent with eagerness. Our dinner conversation was supernatural. One of the boarders, who had purchased Mrs. Crow's Night Side of Nature for his own private delectation, was regarded as a public enemy by the entire household for not having bought 20 copies. The man led a life of supreme wretchedness while he was perusing the volume. A system of espionage was established, of which he was the victim. If he incautiously laid the book down for an instant and left the room, it was immediately seized and read aloud in secret places to a few select. I found myself a person of immense importance, it having leaked out that I was tolerably well versed in the history of supernaturalism, and had once written a story entitled The Pot of Tulips for Harper's Monthly, the foundation of which was a ghost. If a table or a wainscot panel happened to warp when we were assembled in the large drawing room, there was an instant silence, and everyone was prepared for an immediate clanking of chains and a spectral form. After a month of psychological excitement, it was with utmost dissatisfaction that we were forced to acknowledge that nothing in the remotest degree approaching the supernatural had manifested itself. Once the black butler asseverated that his candle had been blown out by some invisible agency while in the act of undressing himself for the night, but as I had more than once discovered this colored gentleman in a condition when one candle must have appeared to him like 2, I thought it possible that by going a step farther in his potations, he might have reversed this phenomenon and seen no candle at all where he ought to have beheld one. Things were in this state when an incident took place so awful and inexplicable in its character that my reason fairly reels at the bare memory of the occurrence. It was the 10th of July. After dinner was over, I repaired, with my friend Dr. Hammond, to the garden to smoke my evening pipe. Independent of certain mental sympathies which existed between the doctor and myself, we were linked together by a secret vice. We both smoked opium. We knew each other's secret and respected it. We enjoyed together that wonderful expansion of thought, that marvelous intensifying of the perceptive faculties, that boundless feeling of existence when we seem to have points of contact with the whole universe. In short, that unimaginable spiritual bliss which I would not surrender for a throne, and which I hope you, reader, will never, never taste. Those hours of opium happiness which the doctor and I spent together in secret were regulated with a scientific accuracy. We did not blindly smoke the drug of paradise and leave our dreams to chance. While smoking, we carefully steered our conversation through the brightest and calmest channels of thought. We talked of the East and endeavored to recall the magical panorama of its glowing scenery. We criticized the most sensuous poets, those who painted life ruddy with health, brimming with passion, happy in the possession of youth and strength and beauty. If we talked of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, we lingered over Ariel and avoided Caliban. Like the Gebers, we turned our faces to the east and saw only the sunny side of the world. This skillful coloring of our train of thought produced in our subsequent visions a corresponding tone. The splendors of Arabian fairyland dyed our dreams. We paced that narrow strip of grass with the tread and port of kings. The song of the Rana Arborea, while he clung to the bark of the ragged plum tree, sounded like the strains of divine orchestras. Houses, walls, and streets melted like rain clouds, and vistas of unimaginable glory stretched away before us. It was a rapturous companionship. We each of us enjoyed the vast delight more perfectly, because even in our most ecstatic moments we were ever conscious of each other's presence. Our pleasures, while individual, were still twin, vibrating and moving in musical accord. On the evening in question, the 10th of July, the doctor and myself found ourselves in an unusually metaphysical mood. We lit our large meerschaums, filled with fine Turkish tobacco, in the core of which burned a little black nut of opium, that, like the nut in the fairy tale, held within its narrow limits wonders beyond the reach of kings. We paced to and fro, conversing. A strange perversity dominated the currents of our thoughts. They would not flow through the sunlit channels, into which we strove to divert them. For some unaccountable reason, they constantly diverged into dark and lonesome beds where a continual gloom brooded. It was in vain that after our old fashion we flung ourselves on the shores of the East and talked of its gay bazaars, of the splendors of the time of Haroun, of harems and golden palaces. Black afrits continually arose from the depths of our talk and expanded like the one the fisherman released from the copper vessel until they blotted everything bright from our vision. Insensibly we yielded to the occult force that swayed us and indulged in gloomy speculation. We had talked some time upon the proneness of the human mind to mysticism and the almost universal love of the terrible, when Hammond suddenly said to me, "What do you consider to be the greatest element of terror?" The question, I own, puzzled me. That many things were terrible, I knew. Stumbling over a corpse in the dark, beholding, as I once did, a woman floating down a deep and rapid river with wildly lifted arms and awful upturned face, uttering as she sank shrieks that rent one's heart, while we, the spectators, stood frozen at a window which overhung the river at a height of 60 feet. unable to make the slightest effort to save her, but dumbly watching her last supreme agony and her disappearance. A shattered wreck, with no life visible, encountered floating listlessly on the ocean, is a terrible object, for it suggests a huge terror, the proportions of which are veiled. But it now struck me for the first time that there must be one great and ruling embodiment of fear, a king of terrors to which all others must succumb. What might it be? To what train of circumstances would it owe its existence? "I confess, Hammond," I replied to my friend, "I never considered the subject before. That there must be one something more terrible than any other thing, I feel. I cannot attempt, however, even the most vague definition." "I am somewhat like you, Harry," he answered. "I feel my capacity to experience a terror greater than anything yet conceived by the human mind, something combining in fearful and unnatural amalgamation hitherto supposed incompatible elements. The calling of the voices in Brockden Brown's novel of Wieland is awful. So is the picture of the dweller of the threshold in Bulwer's Zanoni. But," he added, shaking his head gloomily, "there is something more horrible still than these." "Look here, Hammond," I rejoined, "let us drop this kind of talk, for heaven's sake. We shall suffer for it. Depend on it." "I don't know what's the matter with me tonight," he replied, "but my brain is running upon all sorts of weird and awful thoughts. I feel as if I could write a story like Hoffman tonight, if I were only master of a literary style." "Well, if we're going to be Hoffmanesque in our talk, I'm going off to bed. Opium and nightmares should never be brought together. How sultry it is. Good night, Hammond." "Good night, Harry. Pleasant dreams to you." "To you, gloomy wretch, afrits, ghouls, and enchanters." We parted, and each sought his respective chamber. I undressed quickly and got into bed, taking with me, according to my usual custom, a book, over which I generally read myself to sleep. I opened the volume as soon as I had laid my head upon the pillow, and instantly flung it to the other side of the room. It was Gudin's History of Monsters, a curious French work which I had lately imported from Paris, but which, in the state of mind I was then in, was anything but an agreeable companion. I resolved to go to sleep at once. So turning down my gas until nothing but a little blue point of light glimmered on the top of the tube, I composed myself to rest once more. The room was in total darkness. The atom of gas that still remained lighted did not illuminate a distance of 3 inches round the burner. I desperately drew my arm across my eyes, as if to shut out even the darkness, and tried to think of nothing. It was in vain. The confounded themes touched on by Hammond in the garden kept obtruding themselves on my brain. I battled against them. I erected ramparts of would-be blankness of intellect to keep them out. They still crowded upon me. While I was lying still as a corpse, hoping that by a perfect physical inaction I would hasten mental repose, an awful incident occurred. A something dropped, as it seemed, from the ceiling plumb upon my chest, and the next instant I felt 2 bony hands encircling my throat, endeavoring to choke me. I am no coward, and am possessed of considerable physical strength. The suddenness of the attack, instead of stunning me, stung every nerve to its highest tension. My body acted from instinct before my brain had time to realize the terrors of my position. In an instant I wound 2 muscular arms around the creature and squeezed it with all the strength of despair against my chest. In a few seconds the bony hands that had fastened on my throat loosened their hold, and I was free to breathe once more. Then commenced a struggle of awful intensity. Immersed in the most profound darkness, totally ignorant of the nature of the thing by which I was so suddenly attacked, finding my grasp slipping every moment by reason, it seemed to me of the entire nakedness of my assailant bitten with sharp teeth in the shoulder, neck, and chest, having every moment to protect my throat against a pair of sinewy, agile hands which my utmost efforts could not confine. These were a combination of circumstances to combat which required all the strength and skill and courage that I possessed. At last, after a silent, deadly, exhausting struggle, I got my assailant under by a series of incredible efforts of strength. Once pinned, with my knee on what I had made out to be its chest, I knew that I was victor. I rested for a moment to breathe. I heard the creature beneath me panting in the darkness and felt the violent throbbing of a heart. It was apparently as exhausted as I was. That was one comfort. At this moment I remembered that I usually placed under my pillow, before going to bed, a large yellow silk pocket handkerchief for use during the night. I felt for it instantly. It was there. In a few seconds more I had, after a fashion, pinioned the creature's arms. I now felt tolerably secure. There was nothing more to be done but to turn on the gas, and, having first seen what my midnight assailant was like, arouse the household. I will confess to being actuated by a certain pride in not giving the alarm before. I wished to make the capture alone and unaided. Never loosing my hold for an instant, I slipped from the bed to the floor, dragging my captive with me. I had but a few steps to make to reach the gas burner. These I made with the greatest caution, holding the creature in a grip like a vice. At last I got within arm's length of the tiny speck of blue light, which told me where the gas burner lay. Quick as lightning, I released my grasp with one hand and let on the full flood of light. Then I turned to look at my captive. I cannot even attempt to give any definition of my sensations the instant after I turned on the gas. I suppose I must have shrieked with terror, for in less than a minute afterward my room was crowded with the inmates of the house. I shudder now as I think of that awful moment. I saw nothing. Yes, I had one arm firmly clasped around a breathing, panting, corporeal shape, my other hand gripped with all its strength a throat as warm and apparently fleshy as my own, and yet with this living substance in my grasp, with its body pressed against my own, and all in the bright glare of a large jet of gas, I absolutely beheld nothing, not even an outline, a vapor. I do not even at this hour realize the situation in which I found myself. I cannot recall the astounding incident thoroughly. Imagination in vain tries to compass the awful paradox. It breathed. I felt its warm breath upon my cheek. It struggled fiercely. It had hands. They clutched me. Its skin was smooth, just like my own. There it lay, pressed close up against me, solid as stone, and yet utterly invisible. I wonder that I did not faint or go mad on the instant. Some wonderful instinct must have sustained me, for absolutely, in place of loosening my hold on the terrible enigma, I seemed to gain an additional strength in my moment of horror, and tightened my grasp with such wonderful force that I felt the creature shivering with agony. Just then Hammond entered my room at the head of the household. As soon as he beheld my face, which I suppose must have been an awful sight to look at, he hastened forward, crying, "Great heaven, Harry, what has happened?" "Hammond, Hammond," I cried, "come here. Oh, this is awful. I have been attacked in bed by something or other, of which I have hold of, but I can't see it. I can't see it." Hammond, doubtless struck by my unfeigned horror expressed in my countenance, made one or two steps forward with an anxious yet puzzled expression. A very audible titter burst from the remainder of my visitors. This suppressed laughter made me furious. To laugh at a human being in my position, it was the worst species of cruelty. Now I can understand why the appearance of a man struggling violently, as it would seem, with an airy nothing and calling for assistance against a vision, should have appeared ludicrous. Then, so great was my rage against the mocking crowd, that had I the power, I would have stricken them dead where they stood. "Hammond, Hammond," I cried again, despairingly, "for God's sake, come to me. I can hold the thing but a short while longer. It is overpowering me. Help me! Help me! Harry, whispered Hammond, approaching me, you have been smoking too much opium. I swear to you, Hammond, that this is no vision, I answered in the same low tone. Don't you see how it shakes my whole frame with its struggles? If you don't believe me, convince yourself. Feel it. Touch it. Hammond advanced and laid his hand in the spot I indicated. A wild cry of horror burst from him. He had felt it. In a moment he had discovered somewhere in my room a long piece of cord, and was the next instant winding it and knotting it about the body of the unseen being that I clasped tightly in my arms. Harry, he said in a hoarse, agitated voice, for though he preserved his presence of mind, he was deeply moved. Harry, it's all safe now. You may let go, old fellow, if you're tired. The thing can't move. I was utterly exhausted, and I gladly loosed my hold. Hammond stood holding the ends of the cord that bound the invisible, twisted round his hand, while before him, self-supporting as it were, he beheld a rope laced and interlaced and stretched tightly around a vacant space. I never saw a man look so thoroughly stricken with awe. Nevertheless, his face expressed all the courage and determination which I knew him to possess. His lips, although white, were set firmly, and one could perceive at a glance that, although stricken with fear, he was not daunted. The confusion that ensued among the guests of the house, who were witnesses of this extraordinary scene between Hammond and myself, who beheld the pantomime of binding this struggling something, who beheld me almost sinking from physical exhaustion when my task of jailer was over, the confusion and terror that took possession of the bystanders when they saw all this was beyond description. Many of the weaker ones fled from the apartment. The few who remained behind clustered near the door and could not be induced to approach Hammond and his charge. Still, incredulity broke out through their terror. They had not the courage to satisfy themselves, and yet they doubted. It was in vain that I begged of some of the men to come near and convince themselves by touch of the existence of a living being in that room which was invisible. They were incredulous, but did not dare to undeceive themselves. How could a solid, living, breathing body be invisible? They asked. My reply was this. I gave a sign to Hammond, and both of us, conquering our fearful repugnance to touching the invisible creature, lifted it from the ground, manacled as it was, and took it to my bed. Its weight was about that of a boy of 14. Now, my friends, I said, as Hammond and myself held the creature suspended over the bed, I can give you self-evident proof that here is a solid, ponderable body which nevertheless you cannot see. Be good enough to watch the surface of the bed attentively. I was astonished at my own courage in treating this strange event so calmly, but I had recovered from my first terror and felt a sort of scientific pride in the affair, which dominated every other feeling. The eyes of the bystanders were immediately fixed on my bed. At a given signal, Hammond and I let the creature fall. There was a dull sound of a heavy body alighting on a soft mass. The timbers of the bed creaked. A deep impression marked itself distinctly on the pillow and on the bed itself. The crowd who witnessed this gave a sort of low, universal cry and rushed from the room. Hammond and I were left alone with our mystery. We remained silent for some time, listening to the low, irregular breathing of the creature on the bed and watching the rustle of the bedclothes as it impotently struggled to free itself from confinement. Then Hammond spoke. Harry, this is awful. Aye, awful. But not unaccountable. Not unaccountable? What do you mean? Such a thing has never occurred since the birth of the world. I know not what to think, Hammond. God grant that I am not mad, and that this is not an insane fantasy. Let us reason a little, Harry. Here is a solid body which we touch, but which we cannot see. The fact is so unusual that it strikes us with terror. Is there no parallel, though, for such a phenomenon? Take a piece of pure glass. It is tangible and transparent. A A certain chemical coarseness is all that prevents it being so entirely transparent as to be totally invisible. It is not theoretically impossible, mind you, to fabricate a glass which shall not reflect a single ray of light, a glass so pure and homogeneous in its atoms that the rays from the sun shall pass through it as they do through the air, refracted but not reflected. We do not see the air, and yet we feel it. Oh, that's all very well, Hammond, but these are inanimate substances. Glass does not breathe. The air does not breathe. This thing has a heart that palpitates, a will that moves it, lungs that play and inspire and respire. You forget the strange phenomena of which we have heard so often of late, answered the doctor gravely. All the meetings called spirit circles, invisible hands have been thrust into the hands of those persons round the table, warm, fleshy hands that seemed to pulsate with mortal life. What? Do you think, then, that this thing is, I don't know what it is, was the solemn reply, but please the gods, I will, with your assistance, thoroughly investigate it. We watched together, smoking many pipes, all night long by the bedside of the unearthly being that tossed and panted until it was apparently wearied out. Then we learned, by the low, regular breathing, that it slept. The next morning the house was all astir. The boarders congregated on the landing outside my room, and Hammond and myself were lions. We had to answer 1,000 questions as to the state of our extraordinary prisoner, for as yet not one person in the house, except ourselves, could be induced to set foot in the apartment. The creature was awake. This was evidenced by the convulsive manner in which the bedclothes were moved in its efforts to escape. There was something truly terrible in beholding, as it were, those second-hand indications of the terrible writhings and agonized struggles for liberty, which themselves were invisible. Hammond and myself had racked our brains during the long night to discover some means by which we might realize the shape and general appearance of the enigma. As well as we could make out by passing our hands over the creature's form, its outlines and lineaments were human. There was a mouth, a round, smooth head without hair, a nose which, however, was little elevated above the cheeks, and its hands and feet felt like those of a boy. At first we thought of placing the being on a smooth surface and tracing its outline with chalk, as shoemakers trace the outline of the foot. This plan was given up as being of no value. Such an outline would give not the slightest idea of its conformation. A happy thought struck me. We would take a cast of it in plaster of Paris. This would give us the solid figure and satisfy all our wishes. But how to do it? The movements of the creature would disturb the setting of the plastic covering and distort the mold. Another thought, why not give it chloroform? It had respiratory organs, that was evident by its breathing. Once reduced to a state of insensibility, we could do with it what we would. Dr. X was sent for, and after the worthy physician had recovered from the first shock of amazement, he proceeded to administer the chloroform. In 3 minutes afterward, we were enabled to remove the fetters from the creature's body, and a well-known modeler of this city was busily engaged in covering the invisible form with the moist clay. In 5 minutes more, we had a mold, and before evening, a rough facsimile of the mystery. It was shaped like a man, distorted, uncouth, and horrible, but still a man. It was small, not over 4 feet and some inches in height, and its limbs betrayed a muscular development that was unparalleled. Its face surpassed in hideousness anything I had ever seen. Gustave Doré, or Callot, or Tony Yoeno never conceived anything so horrible. There is a face in one of the latter's illustrations to Un voyage où il vous plairait, which somewhat approaches the countenance of this creature, but does not equal it. It was the physiognomy of what I should have fancied a ghoul to be. It looked as if it was capable of feeding on human flesh. Having satisfied our curiosity and bound everyone in the house over to secrecy, it became a question what was to be done with our enigma. It was impossible that we should keep such a horror in our house. It was equally impossible that such an awful being should be let loose upon the world. I confess that I would have gladly voted for the creature's destruction, but who would shoulder the responsibility? Who would undertake the execution of this horrible semblance of a human being? Day after day, this question was deliberated gravely. The boarders all left the house. Miss Moffat was in despair and threatened Hammond and myself with all sorts of legal penalties if we did not remove the horror. Our answer was, "We will go if you like, but we decline taking this creature with us. Remove it yourself if you please. It appeared in your house. On you the responsibility rests." To this there was, of course, no answer. Mrs. Moffat could not obtain for love or money a person who would even approach the mystery. The most singular part of the transaction was that we were entirely ignorant of what the creature habitually fed on. Everything in the way of nutriment that we could possibly think of was placed before it, but was never touched. It was awful to stand by day after day and see the clothes toss, and hear the hard breathing, and know that it was starving. 10, 12 days, a fortnight passed, and it still lived. The pulsations of the heart, however, were daily growing fainter, and had now nearly ceased altogether. It was evident that the creature was dying for want of sustenance. While this terrible life struggle was going on, I felt miserable. I could not sleep of nights. Horrible as the creature was, it was pitiful to think of the pangs it was suffering. At last, it died. Hammond and I found it cold and stiff one morning in the bed. The heart had ceased to beat, the lungs to inspire. We hastened to bury it in the garden. It was a strange funeral, the dropping of that viewless corpse into the damp hole. The cast of its form I gave to Dr. X, who keeps it in his museum in 10th Street. As I am on the eve of a long journey from which I may not return, I have drawn up this narrative of an event the most singular that has ever come to my knowledge.
Quote, "Your gods and my gods, do you or I know which are the stronger?" End quote. Native proverb. East of Suez, some hold, the direct control of Providence ceases. Man being there, handed over to the power of the gods and devils of Asia, and the Church of England, Providence only exercising an occasional and modified supervision in the case of Englishmen. This theory accounts for some of the more unnecessary horrors of life in India. It may be stretched to explain my story. My friend Strickland of the police, who knows as much of natives of India as is good for any man, can bear witness to the facts of the case. Dumois, our doctor, also saw what Strickland and I saw. The inference which he drew from the evidence was entirely incorrect. He is dead now. He died in a rather curious manner, which has been elsewhere described. When Fleet came to India, he owned a little money and some land in the Himalayas, near a place called Dharamsala. Both properties had been left him by an uncle, and he came out to finance them. He was a big, heavy, genial, and inoffensive man. His knowledge of natives was, of course, limited, and he complained of the difficulties of the language. He rode in from his place in the hills to spend a New Year in the station, and he stayed with Strickland. On New Year's Eve, there was a big dinner at the club, and the night was excusably wet. When men foregather from the uttermost ends of the empire, they have a right to be riotous. The frontier had sent down a contingent of catch-em-alive-os who had not seen 20 white faces for a year, and were used to ride 15 miles to dinner at the next fort, at the risk of a Khyberee bullet, where their drinks should lie. They profited by their new security, for they tried to play pool with a curled-up hedgehog found in the garden, and one of them carried the marker round the room in his teeth. Half a dozen planters had come in from the south, and were talking horse to the biggest liar in Asia, who was trying to cap all their stories at once. Everybody was there, and there was a general closing up of ranks and taking stock of our losses in dead or disabled that had fallen during the past year. It was a very wet night, and I remember that we sang Auld Lang Syne with our feet in the Polo Championship Cup, and our heads among the stars, and swore that we were all dear friends. Then some of us went away and annexed Burma, and some tried to open up the Sudan, and were opened up by fuzzies in that cruel scrub outside Suakim. And some found stars and medals, and some were married, which was bad, and some did other things, which were worse, and the others of us stayed in our chains and strove to make money on insufficient experiences. Fleet began the night with sherry and bitters, drank champagne steadily up to dessert, then raw, rasping Capri with all the strength of whiskey, took Benedictine with his coffee, 4 or 5 whiskeys and sodas to improve his pool strokes, beer and bones at 2:30, winding up with old brandy. Consequently, when he came out at 3:30 in the morning, into 14 degrees of frost, he was very angry with his horse for coughing, and tried to leapfrog into the saddle. The horse broke away and went to his stables. So Strickland and I formed a guard of dishonor to take Fleet home. Our road lay through the bazaar, close to a little temple of Hanuman, the monkey god, who is a leading divinity worthy of respect. All gods have good points, just as have all priests. Personally, I attach much importance to Hanuman, and am kind to his people, the great gray apes of the hills. One never knows when one may want a friend. There was a light in the temple, and as we passed, we could hear the voices of men chanting hymns. In a native temple, the priests rise at all hours of the night to do honor to their god. Before we could stop him, Fleet dashed up the steps, patted 2 priests on the back, and was gravely grinding the ashes of his cigar butt into the forehead of the red stone image of Hanuman. Strickland tried to drag him out, but he sat down and said solemnly, "See that mark of the beast? I made it. Isn't it fine?" In half a minute, the temple was alive and noisy, and Strickland, who knew what came of polluting gods, said that things might occur. He, by virtue of his official position, long residence in the country, and weakness for going among the natives, was known to the priests, and he felt unhappy. Fleet sat on the ground and refused to move. He said that good old Hanuman made a very soft pillow. Then, without any warning, a silver man came out of a recess behind the image of the god. He was perfectly naked in that bitter, bitter cold, and his body shone like frosted silver, for he was what the Bible calls a leper, as white as snow. Also, he had no face, because he was a leper of some years' standing, and his disease was heavy upon him. We stooped to haul Fleet up, and the temple was filling and filling with folk who seemed to spring from the earth, when the silver man ran in under our arms, making a noise exactly like the mewing of an otter, caught Fleet round the body, and dropped his head on Fleet's breast before we could wrench him away. Then he retired to a corner and sat mewing while the crowd blocked all the doors. The priests were very angry until the silver man touched Fleet. That nuzzling seemed to sober them. At the end of a few minutes' silence, one of the priests came to Strickland and said in perfect English, "Take your friend away. He has done with Hanuman, but Hanuman has not done with him." The crowd gave room, and we carried Fleet into the road. Strickland was very angry. He said that we might all three have been knifed, and that Fleet should thank his stars that he had escaped without injury. Fleet thanked no one. He said that he wanted to go to bed. He was gorgeously drunk. We moved on, Strickland silent and wrathful, until Fleet was taken with violent shivering fits and sweating. He said that the smells of the bazaar were overpowering, and he wondered why slaughterhouses were permitted so near English residences. "Can't you smell the blood?" said Fleet. We put him to bed at last, just as dawn was breaking, and Strickland invited me to have another whiskey and soda. While we were drinking, he talked of the trouble in the temple, and admitted that it baffled him completely. Strickland hates being mystified by natives, because his business in life is to overmatch them with their own weapons. He has not yet succeeded in doing this, but in 15 or 20 years he will have made some small progress. "They should have mauled us," he said, "instead of mewing at us. I wonder what they meant. I don't like it one little bit." I said that the managing committee of the temple would, in all probability, bring a criminal action against us for insulting their religion. There was a section of the Indian Penal Code which exactly met Fleet's offense. Strickland said he only hoped and prayed that they would do this. Before I left, I looked into Fleet's room and saw him lying on his right side, scratching his left breast. Then I went to bed cold, depressed, and unhappy at 7 o'clock in the morning. At 1 o'clock, I rode over to Strickland's house to inquire after Fleet's head. I imagined that it would be a sore one. Fleet was breakfasting and seemed unwell. His temper was gone, for he was abusing the cook for not supplying him with an underdone chop. A man who can eat raw meat after a wet night is a curiosity. I told Fleet this, and he laughed. "You breed queer mosquitoes in these parts," he said. "I've been bitten to pieces, but only in one place." "Let's have a look at the bite," said Strickland. "It may have gone down since this morning." While the chops were being cooked, Fleet opened his shirt and showed us, just over his left breast, a mark, the perfect double of the black rosettes, the 5 or 6 irregular blotches arranged in a circle on a leopard's hide. Strickland looked and said, "It was only pink this morning. It's grown black now." Fleet ran to a glass. "By Jove," he said, "this is nasty. What is it?" We could not answer. Here the chops came in, all red and juicy, and Fleet bolted 3 in a most offensive manner. He ate on his right grinders only, and threw his head over his right shoulder as he snapped the meat. When he had finished, it struck him that he had been behaving strangely, for he said apologetically, "I don't think I ever felt so hungry in my life. I've bolted like an ostrich." After breakfast, Strickland said to me, "Don't go. Stay here, and stay for the night." Seeing that my house was not 3 miles from Strickland's, this request was absurd. But Strickland insisted, and was going to say something when Fleet interrupted by declaring in a shamefaced way that he felt hungry again. Strickland sent a man to my house to fetch over my bedding and a horse, and we 3 went down to Strickland's stables to pass the hours until it was time to go out for a ride. The man who has a weakness for horses never wearies of inspecting them, and when 2 men are killing time in this way, they gather knowledge and lies, the one from the other. There were 5 horses in the stables, and I shall never forget the scene as we tried to look them over. They seemed to have gone mad. They reared and screamed and nearly tore up their pickets. They sweated and shivered and lathered and were distraught with fear. Strickland's horses used to know him as well as his dogs, which made the matter more curious. We left the stable for fear of the brutes throwing themselves in their panic. Then Strickland turned back and called me. The horses were still frightened, but they let us gentle and make much of them, and put their heads in our bosoms. "They aren't afraid of us," said Strickland. "Do you know, I'd give 3 months' pay if Outrage here could talk." But Outrage was dumb, and could only cuddle up to his master and blow out his nostrils, as is the custom of horses when they wish to explain things, but can't. Fleet came up when we were in the stalls, and as soon as the horses saw him, their fright broke out afresh. It was all that we could do to escape from the place unkicked. Strickland said, "They don't seem to love you, Fleet." "Nonsense," said Fleet. "My mare will follow me like a dog." He went to her. She was in a loose box, but as he slipped the bars, she plunged, knocked him down, and broke away into the garden. I laughed, but Strickland was not amused. He took his mustache in both fists and pulled at it till it nearly came out. Fleet, instead of going off to chase his property, yawned, saying that he felt sleepy. He went to the house to lie down, which was a foolish way of spending New Year's Day. Strickland sat with me in the stables and asked if I had noticed anything peculiar in Fleet's manner. I said that he ate his food like a beast, but that this might have been the result of living alone in the hills, out of the reach of society, as refined and elevating as ours, for instance. Strickland was not amused. I do not think that he listened to me, for his next sentence referred to the mark on Fleet's breast, and I said that it might have been caused by blister flies, or that it was possibly a birthmark, newly born and now visible for the first time. We both agreed that it was unpleasant to look at, and Strickland found occasion to say that I was a fool. "I can't tell you what I think now," said he, "because you would call me a madman. But you must stay with me for the next few days, if you can. I want you to watch Fleet, but don't tell me what you think till I have made up my mind." "But I am dining out tonight," I said. "So am I," said Strickland, "and so is Fleet. At least, if he doesn't change his mind." We walked about the garden, smoking, but saying nothing, because we were friends, and talking spoils good tobacco, till our pipes were out. Then we went to wake up Fleet. He was wide awake, and fidgeting about his room. "I say, I want some more chops," he said. "Can I get them?" We laughed and said, "Go and change. The ponies will be round in a minute." "All right," said Fleet. "I'll go when I get the chops. Underdone ones, mind." He seemed to be quite in earnest. It was 4 o'clock, and we had had breakfast at 1. Still, for a long time he demanded those underdone chops. Then he changed into riding clothes and went out into the veranda. His pony, the mare had not been caught, would not let him come near. All 3 horses were unmanageable, mad with fear, and finally Fleet said that he would stay at home and get something to eat. Strickland and I rode out wondering. As we passed a temple of Hanuman, the silver man came out and mewed at us. "He is not one of the regular priests of the temple," said Strickland. "I think I should peculiarly like to lay my hands on him." There was no spring in our gallop on the race course that evening. The horses were stale and moved as though they had been ridden out. "The fright after breakfast has been too much for them," said Strickland. That was the only remark he made through the remainder of the ride. Once or twice I think he swore to himself, but that did not count. We came back in the dark at 7 o'clock and saw that there were no lights in the bungalow. "Careless ruffians my servants are," said Strickland. My horse reared at something on the carriage drive, and Fleet stood up under its nose. "What are you doing, groveling about the garden?" said Strickland. But both horses bolted and nearly threw us. We dismounted by the stables and returned to Fleet, who was on his hands and knees under the orange bushes. "What the devil is wrong with you?" said Strickland. Nothing in the world," said Fleet, speaking very quickly and thickly. "I've been gardening, botanizing, you know. The smell of the earth is delightful. I think I'm going for a walk, a long walk, all night." Then I saw that there was something excessively out of order somewhere, and I said to Strickland, I am not dining out." "Bless you," said Strickland. "Here, Fleet, get up. You'll catch fever there. Come in to dinner, and let's have the lamps lit. We'll all dine at home." Fleet stood up unwillingly and said, "No lamps, no lamps. It's much nicer here. Let's dine outside and have some more chops. Lots of 'em, and underdone. Bloody ones with gristle." Now, a December evening in northern India is bitterly cold, and Fleet's suggestion was that of a maniac. "Come in," said Strickland sternly. "Come in at once." Fleet came, and when the lamps were brought, we saw that he was literally plastered with dirt from head to foot. He must have been rolling in the garden. He shrank from the light and went to his room. His eyes were horrible to look at. There was a green light behind them, not in them, if you understand, and the man's lower lip hung down. Strickland said, "There's going to be trouble, big trouble tonight. Don't you change your riding things." We waited and waited for Fleet's reappearance, and ordered dinner in the meantime. We could hear him moving about his own room, but there was no light there. Presently, from the room came the long-drawn howl of a wolf. People write and talk lightly of blood running cold, and hair standing up, and things of that kind. Both sensations are too horrible to be trifled with. My heart stopped, as though a knife had been driven through it, and Strickland turned as white as the tablecloth. The howl was repeated, and was answered by another howl, far across the fields. That set the gilded roof on the horror. Strickland dashed into Fleet's room. I followed, and we saw Fleet getting out of the window. He made beast noises in the back of his throat. He could not answer us when we shouted at him. He spat. I don't quite remember what followed, but I think that Strickland must have stunned him with the long bootjack, or else I should never have been able to sit on his chest. Fleet could not speak. He could only snarl, and his snarls were those of a wolf, not of a man. The human spirit must have been giving away all day, and have died out with the twilight. We were dealing with a beast that had once been Fleet. The affair was beyond any human and rational experience. I tried to say hydrophobia, but the word wouldn't come, because I knew that I was lying. We bound this beast with leather thongs of the punka rope, and tied its thumbs and big toes together, and gagged it with a shoehorn, which makes a very efficient gag if you know how to arrange it. Then we carried it into the dining room and sent a man to Demoise, the doctor, telling him to come over at once. After we had dispatched a messenger and were drawing breath, Strickland said, "It's no good. This isn't any doctor's work." I also knew that he spoke the truth. The beast's head was free, and it threw it about from side to side. Anyone entering the room would have believed that we were curing a wolf's pelt. That was the most loathsome accessory of all. Strickland sat with his chin in the heel of his fist, watching the beast as it wriggled on the ground, but saying nothing. The shirt had been torn open in the scuffle and showed the black rosette mark on the left breast. It stood out like a blister. In the silence of the watching, we heard something without, mewing like a she-otter. We both rose to our feet, and, I answer for myself, not Strickland, felt sick, actually and physically sick. We told each other, as did the men in Pinafore, that it was the cat. Dumois arrived, and I never saw a little man so unprofessionally shocked. He said that it was a heart-rending case of hydrophobia, and that nothing could be done. At least, any palliative measures would only prolong the agony. The beast was foaming at the mouth. Fleet, as we told Dumois, had been bitten by dogs once or twice. Any man who keeps half a dozen terriers must expect a nip now and again. Dumois could offer no help. He could only certify that Fleet was dying of hydrophobia. The beast was then howling, for it had managed to spit out the shoehorn. Dumois said that he would be ready to certify to the cause of death, and that the end was certain. He was a good little man, and he offered to remain with us, but Strickland refused the kindness. He did not wish to poison Dumois's new year. He would only ask him not to give the real cause of Fleet's death to the public. So Dumois left, deeply agitated, and as soon as the noise of the cart wheels had died away, Strickland told me, in a whisper, his suspicions. They were so wildly improbable that he dared not say them out aloud, and I, who entertained all Strickland's beliefs, was so ashamed of owning to them that I pretended to disbelieve. Even if the Silver Man had bewitched Fleet for polluting the image of Hanuman, the punishment could not have fallen so quickly. As I was whispering this, the cry outside the house rose again, and the beast fell into a fresh paroxysm of struggling till we were afraid that the thongs that held it would give away. "Watch," said Strickland. "If this happens 6 times, I shall take the law into my own hands. I order you to help me." He went into his room and came out in a few minutes with the barrels of an old shotgun, a piece of fishing line, some thick cord, and his heavy wooden bedstead. I reported that the convulsions had followed the cry by 2 seconds in each case, and the beast seemed perceptibly weaker. Strickland muttered, "But he can't take away the life. He can't take away the life." I said, though I knew that I was arguing against myself, "It may be a cat. It must be a cat. If the Silver Man is responsible, why does he dare to come here?" Strickland arranged the wood on the hearth, put the gun barrels into the glow of the fire, spread the twine on the table, and broke a walking stick in 2. There was 1 yard of fishing line, gut, lapped with wire, such as is used for mahseer fishing, and he tied the 2 ends together in a loop. Then he said, "How can we catch him? He must be taken alive and unhurt. I said that we must trust in Providence and go out softly with polo sticks into the shrubbery at the front of the house. The man or animal that made the cry was evidently moving round the house as regularly as a night watchman. We could wait in the bushes till he came by and knock him over. Strickland accepted this suggestion, and we slipped out from a bathroom window into the front veranda, and then across the carriage drive into the bushes. In the moonlight, we could see the leper coming round the corner of the house. He was perfectly naked, and from time to time he mewed and stopped to dance with his shadow. It was an unattractive sight, and thinking of poor Fleet, brought to such degradation by so foul a creature, I put away all my doubts and resolved to help Strickland from the heated gun barrels to the loop of twine, from the loins to the head and back again, with all the tortures that might be needful. The leper halted in the front porch for a moment, and we jumped out on him with the sticks. He was wonderfully strong, and we were afraid that he might escape or be fatally injured before we caught him. We had an idea that lepers were frail creatures, but this proved to be incorrect. Strickland knocked his legs from under him, and I put my foot on his neck. He mewed hideously, and even through my riding boots I could feel that his flesh was not the flesh of a clean man. He struck at us with his hand and feet stumps. We looped the lash of a dog whip round him, under the armpits, and dragged him backward into the hall, and so into the dining room where the beast lay. There we tied him with trunk straps. He made no attempt to escape, but mewed. When we confronted him with the beast, the scene was beyond description. The beast doubled backward into a bow as though he had been poisoned with strychnine, and moaned in the most pitiable fashion. Several other things happened also, but they cannot be put down here. "I think I was right," said Strickland. "Now we will ask him to cure this case." But the leper only mewed. Strickland wrapped a towel round his hand and took the gun barrels out of fire. I put the half of the broken walking stick through the loop of the fishing line and buckled the leper comfortably to Strickland's bedstead. I understand then how men and women and little children can endure to see a witch burned alive, for the beast was moaning on the floor, and though the silver man had no face, you could see horrible feelings passing through the slab that took its place, exactly as waves of heat play across red-hot iron gun barrels, for instance. Strickland shaded his eyes with his hands for a moment, and we got to work. This part is not to be printed. The dawn was beginning to break when the leper spoke. His mewings had not been satisfactory up to that point. The beast had fainted from exhaustion, and the house was very still. We unstrapped the leper and told him to take away the evil spirit. He crawled to the beast and laid his hand upon the left breast. That was all. Then he fell, face down, and whined, drawing in his breath as he did so. We watched the face of the beast, and saw the soul of Fleet coming back into the eyes. Then a sweat broke out on the forehead, and the eyes, they were human eyes, closed. We waited for an hour, but Fleet still slept. We carried him to his room and bade the leper go, giving him the bedstead and a sheet on the bedstead to cover his nakedness, the gloves and the towels with which we had touched him, and the whip that had been hooked round his body. He put the sheet about him and went out into the early morning without speaking or mewing. Strickland wiped his face and sat down. A night gong, far away in the city, made 7 o'clock. "Exactly 24 hours," said Strickland, "and I've done enough to ensure my dismissal from the service, besides permanent quarters in a lunatic asylum. Do you believe that we are awake?" The red-hot gun barrel had fallen on the floor and was singeing the carpet. The smell was entirely real. That morning at 11, we two together went to wake up Fleet. We looked and saw that the black leopard rosette on his chest had disappeared. He was very drowsy and tired, but as soon as he saw us, he said, "Oh, confound you fellows. Happy New Year to you. Never mix your liquors. I'm nearly dead." "Thanks for your kindness, but you're over time," said Strickland. "Today is the morning of the 2nd. You've slept the clock round with a vengeance." The door opened, and little Demoise put his head in. He had come on foot, and fancied that we were laying out Fleet. "I brought a nurse," said Demoise. "I suppose that she can come in for what is necessary." "By all means," said Fleet, cheerily, sitting up in bed. "Bring on your nurses." Demoise was dumb. Strickland led him out and explained that there must have been a mistake in the diagnosis. Demoise remained dumb and left the house hastily. He considered that his professional reputation had been injured, and was inclined to make a personal matter of the recovery. Strickland went out too. When he came back, he said that he had been to call on the temple of Hanuman to offer redress for the pollution of the god, and had been solemnly assured that no white man had ever touched the idol, and that he was an incarnation of all the virtues laboring under a delusion. "What do you think?" said Strickland. I said, "There are more things," but Strickland hates that quotation. He says that I have worn it threadbare. One other curious thing happened, which frightened me as much as anything in all the night's work. When Fleet was dressed, he came into the dining room and sniffed. He had a quaint trick of moving his nose when he sniffed. "Horrid doggy smell here," said he. "You should really keep those terriers of yours in better order. Try sulphur, Strick." But Strickland did not answer. He caught hold of the back of a chair, and without warning, went into an amazing fit of hysterics. It is terrible to see a strong man overtaken with hysteria. Then it struck me that we had fought for Fleet's soul with the Silver Man in that room, and had disgraced ourselves as Englishmen forever. And I laughed and gasped and gurgled just as shamefully as Strickland, while Fleet thought that we had both gone mad. We never told him what we had done. Some years later, when Strickland had married and was a church-going member of society for his wife's sake, we reviewed the incident dispassionately, and Strickland suggested that I should put it before the public. I cannot myself see that this step is likely to clear up the mystery, because, in the first place, no one will believe a rather unpleasant story, and in the second, it is well known to every right-minded man that the gods of the heathen are stone and brass, and any attempt to deal with them otherwise is justly condemned.